Number Part 1, The New Neighbors. Pine Ridge Estates wasn't just any neighborhood. Nestled in the heart of the mountains, it was a place where people went to escape the chaos of city life. The air smelled like pine trees, and every cabin had its own charm, some rustic, others modern, but all blending perfectly with nature. It was peaceful, quiet, and exactly what Jack and his wife were looking for when they decided to buy their first vacation home. But there was one thing about Pine Ridge Estates that everyone talked about: the HOA. Short for Homeowners Association. This group wasn't your average bunch of rule followers. They were strict, almost militant, about keeping things perfect. Every fence had to be painted a certain shade of brown. No lawn could have even a single weed poking out. And heaven forbid if you dared hang a wind chime without permission. When Jack and his wife moved into their cozy little cabin, they knew about the HOA rules. They'd read through the thick packet during closing, nodding along as the real estate agent explained how important it was to stay compliant. But honestly, they didn't think much of it. To them, the cabin was supposed to be a getaway, a place to relax, unwind, and forget about rules for a while. Enter Karen. Karen was the unofficial queen of the HOA. She wasn't officially in charge, but everyone acted like she was. Armed with her clipboard and an unshakable sense of authority, she patrolled the streets of Pine Ridge Estates like a guard dog protecting its territory. If someone's mailbox leaned slightly to the left, Karen noticed. If a kid left a bike on the front porch overnight, Karen sent a strongly worded email. Some people called her passionate, others called her unbearable. Either way, no one crossed her without consequences. From the moment Jack and his wife arrived, Karen made it clear she had her eye on them. On their very first day, as they were unloading boxes from their truck, she appeared at the end of their driveway like clockwork. Dressed in neatly pressed khakis and a polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo, she introduced herself with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," she said, handing over a folder stuffed with papers. "I'm Karen, head of the welcoming committee. You'll find everything you need to know about our community guidelines here. If you have questions or concerns, I'm always available." Jack thanked her politely, though he couldn't help noticing the way she lingered, watching as they carried furniture inside. Later that evening, while unpacking dishes in the kitchen, his wife remarked, "She seems intense." That was putting it mildly. Over the next few weeks, Karen popped up more often than either of them cared to admit. Sometimes it was under the guise of being helpful, offering tips on planting shrubs or recommending local contractors. Other times, it felt less friendly. Like the time she stopped by to remind them that their curtains needed to match the approved color palette. Or the weekend she pointed out that their firewood pile was technically too close to the property line. At first, Jack and his wife tried to brush it off. After all, they weren't doing anything wrong. Their cabin was clean, well-maintained, and far from the worst-looking house in the area. But Karen's constant presence started to wear thin. It wasn't so much what she said, it was the tone. The implication that they weren't good enough. That they didn't belong. Then came the inspection request. One crisp morning, Karen knocked on their door holding yet another folder. This time, she explained that the HOA required regular inspections of all properties to ensure compliance with safety standards. "It's nothing personal," she assured them, flashing that same stiff smile. "Just routine." His wife, standing beside him, hesitated. "I don't think we're comfortable with that," she said firmly but politely. "We value our privacy." Karen blinked, clearly caught off guard. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but instead, she nodded tightly. "Of course," she said, her voice clipped. "I'll note your concerns. But please understand, these inspections are mandatory. We'll revisit this soon." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away. Neither Jack nor his wife thought much of it after she left. They figured Karen would move on to her next target, leaving them alone. But deep down, they both sensed something brewing. Refusing the inspection hadn't just irritated Karen, it had challenged her authority. And challenging Karen? Well, that was never a good idea. What they didn't realize was that this small act of defiance would set off a chain reaction neither of them could have predicted. Because Karen wasn't used to being told no. And she certainly wasn't used to losing control. Little did they know, their peaceful mountain retreat was about to become the center of a storm. Karen wasn't the type to let things slide. When Jack's wife shut the door on her inspection request, it didn't just bruise her ego, it lit a fire under her. To Karen, rules weren't just guidelines, they were sacred. And anyone who dared question them was practically committing treason in her eyes. So when she left their cabin that morning, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand, her mind was already racing with ways to make them pay for their defiance. Over the next few weeks, life at the cabin turned into something out of a bad sitcom. Anonymous letters started showing up in their mailbox. At first glance, they looked official, printed neatly on plain white paper, signed with initials instead of a name, but the tone gave them away. "Your trash cans are not aligned properly," one read. "This violates Section 3.2 of the HOA Handbook." Another accused them of leaving outdoor lights on past midnight, which apparently disturbed the serenity of the neighborhood. Jack found the whole thing ridiculous. "Who even cares about this stuff?" he muttered one evening, tossing yet another letter onto the kitchen counter. His wife shrugged, trying to stay calm, but it was clear the constant nitpicking was getting to her too. They weren't breaking any real laws or causing harm to anyone, yet here they were being treated like criminals. It wasn't just the letters, though. One morning, they woke up to find their trash cans scattered across the driveway. The lids were gone, and bits of garbage littered the ground. At first, they thought an animal had gotten into them overnight. But when it happened again and then a third time, they began to suspect foul play. Their suspicions deepened when Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who lived 2 cabins down, stopped by one afternoon with a warning. "You should be careful," she said, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Karen's been talking. She says you're troublemakers, that you don't respect the community." Jack raised an eyebrow. "We haven't done anything wrong." Mrs. Peterson nodded sympathetically. "I know that. But you have to understand how Karen operates. Once she sets her sights on someone, she doesn't stop until she gets what she wants." The advice weighed heavily on both of them. For a while, they debated whether to confront Karen directly. Maybe if they explained themselves, or better yet, stood their ground, she'd back off. But every time they considered it, they hesitated. Confrontations rarely ended well with people like Karen. Instead, his wife suggested they start documenting everything. Every strange note, every misplaced item, every odd encounter. They wrote it all down, snapping photos whenever possible. Despite their efforts to stay calm, the tension kept building. Then came the Saturday morning that pushed things over the edge. It was early, the sun barely peeking through the trees, when there was a sharp knock at the door. Jack answered, still in his pajamas, expecting maybe a neighbor stopping by to borrow something. Instead, he found Karen standing there, looking as put together as ever despite the hour. Her hair was perfectly styled, her clothes pressed, and her clipboard tucked under one arm like armor. "I'm here for the inspection," she announced without preamble. Her voice was firm, almost rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror. Jack blinked, caught off guard. "What? You can't just show up unannounced." "It's part of the HOA policy," Karen replied smoothly. "Emergency inspections are allowed in cases where compliance is questioned." His wife appeared behind him, wrapping a sweater around her shoulders. "We've already told you we're not comfortable with that," she said firmly. "You can't force your way in." For a split second, Karen looked like she might argue. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her clipboard, and her lips pressed into a thin line. But then, seemingly realizing she wasn't going to win this round, she forced a tight smile. "Very well," she said, turning to leave. But mark my words, this isn't over. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, his wife let out a frustrated sigh. She's unbelievable. Jack shook his head, running a hand through his messy hair. What does she think we're hiding? A meth lab. They laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood, but the truth was neither of them felt particularly amused. There was something unsettling about the way Karen carried herself, like she truly believed she was untouchable. It made them wonder, how far was she willing to go? That evening, as they sat on the porch sipping coffee, they talked about what to do next. Jack wanted to march over to Karen's house and give her a piece of his mind. He hated bullies, especially ones who hid behind rules to justify their behavior. But his wife urged caution. If we lose our cool, she wins, she reminded him. Let's keep documenting everything. If things get worse, we'll have proof. Neither of them realized just how right she was. Because Karen wasn't done, not by a long shot. In fact, her campaign against them was about to take a turn neither of them could have anticipated. Karen spent the next several days stewing. She couldn't understand why Jack and his wife refused to play along. Didn't they realize how much easier life would be if they just followed the rules? To her, their resistance wasn't just inconvenient, it was personal. And Karen didn't take things personally lightly. One afternoon, sitting at her dining room table surrounded by stacks of papers and highlighters, she decided to dig deeper. If they wouldn't comply willingly, maybe she could find something else to hold over their heads. Something that would force them to fall in line. She started with public records, combing through property deeds and tax filings. Nothing jumped out at her, so she moved on to social media. Their profiles were private, but she managed to piece together a few details from mutual friends in the neighborhood. Still, nothing damning. Frustrated but undeterred, she expanded her search, calling local authorities under the guise of reporting suspicious activity at their cabin. And that's when things took a surprising turn. While poking around online, Karen stumbled upon something she hadn't expected, an old court document involving her own name. At first, she dismissed it as irrelevant, a remnant of her messy divorce years ago. But as she scrolled through the file, her blood ran cold. Tucked away in the fine print was a detail she'd forgotten or perhaps chosen to ignore. There was an active warrant out for her arrest. The revelation hit her like a freight train. Years earlier, during her bitter custody battle, she'd been accused of harassing her ex-husband. The charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, but because she'd failed to appear in court for a hearing, the warrant remained open. Somehow, no one had bothered to close it, and now, thanks to her own meddling, she'd brought it back into the spotlight. Panic set in almost immediately. What if someone found out? What if Jack and his wife discovered her secret and used it against her? The thought was unbearable. Desperate to protect herself, Karen doubled down on her mission to discredit them. If she could paint them as troublemakers, maybe everyone would focus on them instead of her. But as Karen plotted her next move, she had no idea just how quickly her world was about to unravel. Karen wasn't the type to sit around and wait for trouble to find her. Trouble was something she preferred to control, manipulate, and twist in her favor. But this time, the tables had turned, and the weight of that outstanding warrant pressed down on her like a boulder. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and barely managed to keep her composure during HOA meetings. Every knock at her door made her jump. Every phone call sent her heart racing. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years accusing others of breaking rules while hiding a secret that could ruin her reputation. And now, thanks to her own overzealousness, she'd inadvertently put herself in the crosshairs. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got, not at herself, but at Jack and his wife. If they hadn't been so stubborn, if they'd just let her inspect their cabin like everyone else, none of this would have happened. In her mind, it was all their fault. Determined to shift the focus back onto them, Karen decided to escalate her campaign. She didn't care how far she had to go or what lines she had to cross. All that mattered was protecting herself and keeping her secret buried. It started with small things. One morning, as Jack backed out of the driveway to head into town, he noticed fresh tire marks gouged into the gravel near their mailbox. It looked like someone had deliberately driven off-road and scuffed up the landscaping. He sighed, shook his head, and figured it was probably kids messing around. But when he returned home later that day, he found their garden hose lying in the middle of the road, completely flattened. A car had clearly run over it. His wife was livid. "This isn't kids," she said, holding up the mangled hose. "This is deliberate." Jack agreed, though neither of them wanted to say the obvious: Karen was behind it. They cleaned up the mess, patched the landscaping, and tried to move on. But the pranks kept coming. Their porch light mysteriously stopped working one night, only for them to discover the bulb had been unscrewed. A week later, someone dumped a bag of leaves onto their front steps. Then came the noise complaints filed anonymously, of course claiming their late-night conversations were disturbing the peace. Each incident chipped away at their patience. At first, they laughed it off, thinking it was too petty to take seriously. But after weeks of relentless harassment, even the smallest thing felt like an attack. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching TV, Jack turned to his wife and said, "We can't keep ignoring this. Something has to give." She nodded, staring out the window toward Karen's house in the distance. "I know. But what do we do? Fighting back only seems to make her worse." Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe it's time we hit back where it hurts. Publicly." Unbeknownst to Jack and his wife, Karen was planning her own counterattack. For days, she'd been holed up in her home office, surrounded by piles of paper and empty coffee cups. She'd gone through every resource she could think of, searching for anything she could use against them. Property records, social media posts, even old utility bills, nothing was off limits. When she finally struck gold, it wasn't because of anything illegal they'd done. It was because of something perfectly legal but potentially embarrassing. Buried deep in public documents, Karen discovered that Jack and his wife had briefly rented out their cabin on a vacation rental platform before moving in full-time. Technically, short-term rentals were banned in Pine Ridge estates unless approved by the HOA board, a rule Jack and his wife either didn't know about or had forgotten. To Karen, this was the smoking gun she'd been looking for. She photocopied the evidence, highlighted key sections, and drafted a formal complaint to present at the next neighborhood meeting. But Karen wasn't content to stop there. Knowing that allegations alone might not be enough to sway the community, she decided to add some flair. She created a slideshow presentation complete with photos of their cabin, screenshots of the rental listing, and quotes from the HOA handbook. By the time she was done, it looked less like a report and more like a trial prosecution. As the meeting date approached, Karen grew increasingly confident. This was her moment to shine, to prove once and for all that Jack and his wife were the real problem in Pine Ridge Estates. She rehearsed her speech in front of the mirror, practicing dramatic pauses and stern expressions. She even bought a new outfit for the occasion, a navy blazer with gold buttons that screamed authority. What Karen failed to consider, however, was the growing unrest among her neighbors. While some people admired her dedication to enforcing the rules, others were starting to see her behavior for what it truly was: obsessive and vindictive. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who lived nearby, had quietly warned several residents about Karen's antics. Others had noticed the string of strange occurrences targeting Jack and his wife and weren't convinced it was mere coincidence. Still, Karen remained oblivious to the cracks forming in her carefully constructed facade. She believed she had the upper hand, that her evidence would silence any doubts. What she didn't realize was that her biggest mistake wasn't going after Jack and his wife, it was underestimating them. The night of the neighborhood meeting arrived, and the community center buzzed with tension. Normally, these gatherings were low-key affairs, filled with polite discussions about landscaping budgets and holiday decorations. Tonight, however, the room felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, but many attendees linger. When Karen stood up to speak, clutching her folder and wearing her polished blazer, the room fell silent. She began confidently, pacing back and forth as she laid out her case against Jack and his wife. Her voice carried authority, her slides flashing on the screen behind her. For a moment, it seemed like she might actually pull it off until Jack raised his hand. "Before you go any further," he said, standing up calmly, "there's something I'd like to share." From his pocket, he pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. The room filled with Karen's voice, angry, demanding, and unmistakably threatening. It was a recording of one of her late-night calls, where she'd accused them of ruining the neighborhood and vowed to make them regret crossing her. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people exchanged shocked glances. Even Mrs. Peterson shook her head, muttering, "I knew it." Karen froze, her face pale, as Jack continued. "We've been documenting everything," he explained, pulling out a stack of papers filled with notes, timestamps, and photographs. "Every letter, every prank, every threat. We didn't want to believe our neighbor could act this way, but here we are." For the first time, Karen looked unsure of herself. She stammered, trying to defend her actions, but the damage was done. The room had turned against her. Just as things seemed to reach a boiling point, a knock echoed through the hall. Everyone turned to see a sheriff's deputy standing in the doorway, scanning the room. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Is there a Karen here?" The color drained from Karen's face as she slowly raised her hand. The deputy stepped forward, asking her to come with him. As it turned out, an anonymous tip, likely from Karen herself in her panic, had alerted authorities to potential misconduct in the area. During routine checks, they discovered the active warrant still hanging over her head. In that moment, Karen realized her game was up. Handcuffed and escorted out of the room, she left behind a stunned audience and two neighbors who finally felt a glimmer of peace returning to their mountain retreat. Karen's presentation was supposed to be her grand finale, the moment where she exposed Jack and his wife as rule breakers and cemented her status as the guardian of Pine Ridge Estates. But instead of applause, all she got was silence and then chaos. When the sheriff's deputy walked into the room, asking for Karen by name, it felt like time stopped. For a second, no one moved. Then, slowly, heads turned toward her. She stood frozen, clutching her folders so tightly her knuckles turned white. The deputy repeated his question, louder this time, "Is there a Karen here?" Her voice shook as she raised her hand, barely above a whisper. "That's me." The deputy nodded and gestured for her to come forward. As she stepped out of the crowd, whispers erupted around the room. Some people looked shocked, others exchanged knowing glances. No one said a word in her defense, not even the few who had once supported her crusade against Jack and his wife. As Karen was led away, the deputy explained briefly that there was an active warrant for her arrest related to an old legal issue. He didn't go into specifics, but the damage was done. Everyone knew enough to piece together the truth. Karen wasn't just a strict enforcer of rules, she was someone with secrets of her own. And those secrets had finally caught up with her. After the initial shock wore off, the meeting dissolved into murmurs and side conversations. People lingered, unsure whether to leave or stay. Jack and his wife sat quietly in their seats, watching as the scene unfolded. They hadn't expected things to escalate this way, it was almost surreal. One minute, they were defending themselves against baseless accusations, and the next, Karen was being handcuffed and taken away. Mrs. Peterson approached them cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her. "I'm sorry you had to deal with all of that," she said softly. "None of us realized how far she'd go." Jack gave her a small smile. "It's not your fault. We're just glad it's over." His wife added, "Honestly, we never wanted any of this drama. We just wanted to enjoy our cabin in peace." Mrs. Peterson nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. She always did have a temper. I guess we should have seen the signs sooner. As more neighbors came up to offer apologies or express relief, Jack and his wife couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, they were relieved that Karen's reign of terror was finally over. On the other hand, the whole ordeal left a bitter taste in their mouths. How could someone let their obsession with control spiral so far out of hand? Over the following days, news of Karen's arrest spread quickly through Pine Ridge Estates. It became the talk of the neighborhood, with everyone speculating about what had really happened. Some people thought she deserved what she got, while others felt sympathy for her, wondering if years of loneliness and frustration had driven her to such extremes. Either way, one thing was clear: Karen wouldn't be returning to her role as HOA enforcer anytime soon. Without her constant presence looming over them, life in the community began to change. Neighbors started talking to each other more openly, sharing stories and laughter instead of complaints. The tension that had hung heavy in the air for months seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of calm. Even the HOA meetings felt lighter, with discussions focusing on practical matters rather than nitpicking minor infractions. For Jack and his wife, the shift was welcome. They no longer felt like outsiders looking in; they belonged. People waved when they passed by, invited them to barbecues, and even offered to help with small projects around the cabin. It was a stark contrast to the hostility they'd faced before. But despite the newfound harmony, they couldn't shake the memory of everything they'd been through. Sitting on their porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the mountains, they reflected on the past few weeks. "I never thought moving here would turn into such a mess," Jack admitted, sipping his coffee. "All we wanted was a quiet place to escape." His wife sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Me neither. But maybe it's a good reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself is worth it, even if it gets messy." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "Still, I can't believe how far she went. That woman had serious issues." "Yeah," his wife agreed. "But at least now we know she won't be bothering anyone else." Meanwhile, Karen found herself facing consequences far greater than she'd imagined. After her arrest, the warrant resurfaced details about her past behavior during her divorce, a pattern of harassment and intimidation that she'd managed to keep hidden for years. Facing possible jail time, she struck a plea deal instead. In exchange for avoiding prison, she agreed to attend anger management classes, perform community service, and pay restitution to those affected by her actions. While the legal process played out, Karen retreated from public life. Her house sat empty most days, its curtains drawn tight. Occasionally, neighbors spotted her leaving early in the morning or returning late at night, but she avoided eye contact and kept to herself. The confident, clipboard-wielding woman who once ruled Pine Ridge Estates was gone, replaced by someone humbled and perhaps broken by her own choices. Some residents felt pity for her, recognizing that her behavior stemmed from deeper issues. Others saw her downfall as poetic justice, a reminder that power abused often comes back to haunt you. Either way, Karen's absence marked a turning point for the community. Without her rigid enforcement of trivial rules, people began to relax and embrace a more laid-back approach to living. For Jack and his wife, the resolution brought both closure and reflection. They learned valuable lessons about resilience, patience, and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. More importantly, they discovered the strength of their partnership. Through every challenge, they had supported each other, refusing to let Karen's antics tear them apart. Their cabin, once the epicenter of conflict, transformed into a sanctuary once again. They decorated it with care, adding personal touches that made it feel truly theirs. Friends and family visited often, filling the space with laughter and warmth. Life wasn't perfect; there were still occasional reminders of Karen's influence, but it was peaceful. One evening, as they sat by the fire pit roasting marshmallows, Jack looked at his wife and smiled. "You know," he said, "we may have gotten more excitement than we bargained for, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." She laughed, nudging him playfully. Speak for yourself. I could have done without the midnight vandalism. True, he conceded. But look at us now. Stronger than ever. And they were. Despite everything, they had emerged from the storm intact, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. Life in Pine Ridge Estates had changed dramatically since Karen's arrest. The once tense atmosphere gave way to a newfound sense of freedom and camaraderie among the neighbors. People who had previously kept to themselves now exchanged friendly waves and stopped to chat over fences. Barbecues became a regular occurrence, with families gathering on weekends to share food, laughter, and stories. It was as if a heavy fog had lifted, revealing the warmth and kindness that had always existed beneath the surface. For Jack and his wife, the transformation was especially noticeable. They were no longer seen as outsiders or troublemakers, instead, they became respected members of the community. Neighbors often dropped by their cabin unannounced, not to complain or criticize, but to bring homemade pies or ask for gardening tips. Their porch, once a quiet retreat, turned into a hub of activity where people lingered to enjoy the view and each other's company. Even the HOA meetings took on a different tone. Without Karen's iron grip, discussions focused less on nitpicking minor violations and more on improving the neighborhood as a whole. Someone suggested organizing a community cleanup day, while another proposed hosting an annual holiday party. Ideas flowed freely, and everyone felt empowered to contribute. For the first time, the rules didn't feel suffocating, they felt like guidelines meant to enhance life, not control it. Despite the positive changes, though, Karen's absence left a void. Some residents missed her dedication, even if they hadn't always agreed with her methods. Others wondered what had driven her to act the way she did. Mrs. Peterson, ever the voice of reason, offered some insight during one of their casual porch conversations. Karen wasn't always like this, she said thoughtfully, sipping a cup of tea. When she first moved here, she was just a mom trying to make sure her kids grew up in a nice place. But somewhere along the way, she lost sight of what really mattered. Jack nodded, understanding the sentiment. It's like she got so caught up in enforcing the rules that she forgot about the people behind them. His wife added, and maybe she was dealing with her own stuff too. Like that warrant, it must have been eating away at her for years. Mrs. Peterson sighed. That's probably true. Still, it's sad to see someone self-destruct like that. As weeks turned into months, Karen resurfaced occasionally, at first through updates from the legal proceedings, then later in person. She completed her court-mandated therapy sessions and began volunteering at a local shelter as part of her community service requirement. Her appearances in the neighborhood were rare and subdued. When she did venture out, she wore oversized sunglasses and walked quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. At first, many residents weren't sure how to react. Should they acknowledge her? Offer support? Or simply ignore her altogether? Over time, however, curiosity gave way to indifference. Most people decided to let the past stay in the past, focusing instead on building a better future for themselves and their families. One crisp autumn morning, Karen knocked on Jack and his wife's door. They opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Standing before them was a woman who looked nothing like the fiery enforcer they'd come to know. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and her usual blazer and khakis combo had been replaced with jeans and a plain sweater. I wanted to apologize," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I know I caused a lot of trouble for you, for everyone. And I'm sorry." Jack and his wife exchanged glances, surprised by the sincerity in her words. After a moment, his wife spoke up. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." Karen nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about my actions, about how I treated people. I realize now that I let my anger get the best of me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll understand why I acted the way I did." Jack stepped forward, extending a hand. "We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them. Karen hesitated for a second before shaking his hand. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. That encounter marked a turning point not just for Karen, but for the entire community. While she never fully regained her former status, her willingness to take responsibility earned her a measure of respect. Slowly, she started attending neighborhood events again, keeping a low profile but contributing where she could. Whether it was helping set up chairs for a potluck or pitching in during the annual cleanup day, Karen proved that she was capable of change. For Jack and his wife, seeing her efforts brought a sense of closure. They knew they'd never forget the challenges they'd faced, but they also recognized that holding on to bitterness wouldn't serve them or anyone else. Instead, they chose to focus on the positives, the friendships they'd built, the memories they'd created, and the lessons they'd learned. Looking back on everything, Jack and his wife realized that their journey in Pine Ridge Estates had been about more than just surviving Karen's antics. It had taught them resilience, patience, and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. More importantly, it had strengthened their bond, reminding them that no matter how tough things got, they could count on each other. Their cabin, once a battleground, became a symbol of triumph. Every creaky floorboard and flickering light told a story of perseverance, growth, and ultimately, peace. Visitors often commented on how welcoming the space felt, unaware of the drama that had unfolded within its walls. To Jack and his wife, that was the greatest victory of all. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Jack leaned back in his chair and smiled. You know, we came here looking for a getaway. Turns out, we found something even better. His wife raised an eyebrow, amused. Oh yeah? What's that? A home, he replied simply. Not just a house, but a real home with good people, great memories, and a whole lot of character. She laughed softly, resting her head on his shoulder. Well, if nothing else, we definitely earned it. And they had. Through every challenge, every argument, and every moment of doubt, they had emerged stronger than ever. Pine Ridge Estates may have tested them in ways they never expected, but it had also given them something priceless, a place to belong.